Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing about the software requirement analysis and specification, that is the SRS part of the software engineering. Now, first of all, the requirements describe what we have to do and not how we have to do. Okay, requirement means that what all things the customer needs from the software. So it produces one large document which is written in natural language and contains a description of what the system will do, and it does not describe that how it will do. That means what all the requirements the customer wants, that requirements are noted down in the requirement engineering phase. So the crucial process steps are the quality of the product, and it gives the process which creates it. Without a well-written document, the developers do not know what to build, and the customers, they on the other hand do not know what to expect and what to validate. So it is SRS, software requirement specification document, is a legal document which tells about the requirements of the customer. Now, what all requirement engineering consists of? In the requirement engineering, we give a problem statement, and the final output we get as the SRS, which is the software requirement specification document. So what are the steps which are required in the requirement engineering? The first step is the requirement elicitation. That means we have to gather all the requirements of the customer. Requirement elicitation means to bring forward. So we are bringing forward each and every requirement of the customer by various methods. We have various methods in requirement elicitation, like we have brainstorming sessions, we have rapid questionnaire sessions, in which we collect all sorts of requirements, which can be the requirements, A to Z requirements of the customer, we try to gather. Why? Because we want to, at this stage only, we want to gather all the requirements, so that when we are in a later stage at the designing step or at the implementation step, then a new requirement doesn't come up. So that is why with different interview sessions, brainstorming sessions, fast sessions, we try to inquire about all the smallest of the smallest requirements we try to gather of the customer, so that all the requirements are ready before us, before we go on to the designing phase. Before we start off with the designing phase, we have all the requirements ready with us, so that at later stage we are not in a situation that okay, now we have to rework on the design and on the implementation phase. So requirement elicitation is a very, very important step. In fact, the entire requirement engineering is a very, very crucial step in the entire life cycle of the software. Then once all the requirements have been elicited, all the requirements have been gathered through different types of sessions we take with the customers, all those requirements are then analyzed. That is, we have the requirement analysis phase. Then once all the analysis means we are analyzing that whether all the requirements which have been given by the customer, they are feasible or not, they can be developed properly or not, whether they are not very obsolete, and all those requirements they are actually practical. Okay, like means they can be fulfilled by the developer. So analysis is also very important. Once all the requirements have been gathered, those requirements have to be analyzed. Now, after the analysis portion has been done, we do the requirement documentation. That means we make a document of all the requirements which have been first gathered and analyze that okay, they are feasible, they are technically feasible, they are in a state that which can be developed by the developers. So then the requirements are documented and we make a requirement documentation. Once the documentation is complete, we do a requirement review. Now, when the documentation is done, it is not in a one shot that the document is totally correct. That document needs to be revised. Revised in the sense it needs to be reviewed. There are various review meetings that are carried on, which review that document, requirement document, and then if there are any changes, then those changes are inculcated, and then again a revised requirement document is made. So that due to this, by taking these requirement reviews, they help a lot. How they help us? They help us in refining the documents, refining the requirement document. because at this initial stage it looks very simple, but this is actually very crucial stage of the software, in the life cycle of the software. Because requirements, when we know exactly what the requirements are, then according to those requirements only we are going to make the design. We are going to make an efficient design when we have all the requirements listed with us. So once we have all these 4 steps completed, that is, the elicitation has been done. After the elicitation, that means the requirements have been gathered, then all the requirements have been analyzed. Once they have analyzed, requirement have been documented, and once the requirements have been documented, a review process goes on for the documentation. That means we do a requirement review process. Then once all these 4 things are complete, we have our SRS ready, that is the software requirement specification document. So these are the crucial process steps of the requirement engineering. We will be discussing these steps only, and when all these steps are complete, we have the SRS in hand. SRS is the software requirement specification document. So this is it's like a contract which is signed between the customer and the developer, so that when the final software is delivered to the customer doesn't come up with a new requirement that, oh, you have not delivered me this thing. So that means the developer is going to develop the software according to the SRS document, which is a contract that, okay, the customer, okay, these are the requirements and the developer will fulfill these requirements, so that no one can say at a later stage, the developer cannot say that these were not the requirements, because the requirements were actually stated in the SRS in the requirement phase only, and neither the customer can ask for something more, neither the developer can deliver something less. So that is why in the beginning only the problem statement is given, and with the help of the requirement engineering, the developer gives the SRS. So in the making of this SRS, the customer and the developer, both of them play an important role. It is not that SRS is made only on the developer end. The customer also has to give constant feedback on this SRS at this requirement phase time. So the involvement of both is there in the SRS time. Because when the customer is involved, when we are gathering the requirements, because requirements will come from the customer end only, and then those requirements will be analyzed by the developer and the document will be made. So requirement engineering is the disciplined application of proven principles, methods, tools and notations to describe a proposed system's behavior and the associated constraints. SRS may act, it is a contract between developer and the customer. So requirements are very difficult to uncover. Requirements may change. The over-reliance can be on the case tools. The project schedule can be very tight. Communication barriers can be there between the customer and the developer. Then market-driven software development, and there can be lack of resources. Now, when we come to requirements, there are 3 types of requirements. First, we have the known requirements, then we have the unknown requirements, and then we have the undreamed requirements. Now, requirements can be functional or they can be non-functional. Now, functional requirements, they describe what the software has to do. That is, functional requirements tell that what should be the functionality of the software. So, they are often called as the product features, the features of the software or the features of the product that is going to be delivered. Then non-functional requirements are mostly quality requirements that stipulate how well the software is going to do what it has to do. So for users, we have availability should be there, reliability should be there, usability should be there, and there should be flexibility. And on the developer end, the software should have maintainability, portability, and testability. Now, there are user and system requirements. User requirements are written for the users and they include functional as well as non-functional requirement. System requirements, they are derived from the user requirement. And the user system requirements are the parts of the software requirement specification document. Now next we have the interface specification, which is important for the customers, which tells us that how many and what all types of interfaces are required. That means if any procedural interfaces are there, like some API, some application programming interfaces are required, what all data structures are there, and what and how we have to represent the data. Now once they then we do the feasibility study. That means we see whether the software is technically feasible or not. So it is technically feasible to is it technically feasible to provide direct communication connectivity through space from one location of globe to the another location, and is it technically feasible to design a programming language using, this is just an example that has been given, that is it technically feasible that whatever the requirements of the customer are, that has to be checked whether technical feasibility is there or not in the requirements. Now feasibility, it depends upon non-technical issues also, like are the project's cost and schedule assumption realistic, whether the customer has not made any unrealistic cost and unrealistic schedule assumption, does the business model look really realistic, and is there any market for the product or not. That means what the customer is wanting, is there any market also, or is it an obsolete thing that the customer is demanding. So these all things come under the feasibility study, that the customer and the developer has to see that whether what all the things the customer is asking me, those are actually feasible also or not, or I'm just going to develop them and they're not feasible. If they're not feasible, how is the developer going to develop them? So instead of repenting later on the stage that the developer is not able to develop them, the developer has to ensure this at the time of making the SRS document only. All these aspects have to be considered before we go on to the designing phase, before we go on to the implementation phase. That is why all these things are very, very crucial when we go on for making big projects, big softwares. Then what is the purpose of feasibility study? The purpose of feasibility study is to do the evaluation or analysis of the potential impact of a proposed project or a program. Now the focus of feasibility study, it lies that is the product concept viable, whether the concept of the product is viable or not. Will it be possible to develop a product that matches the project vision statement, or is it something totally going against the vision of the project? Then what are the current estimated cost and schedule for the project? Because whether the cost not too high that the customer has customer has quoted for, that whether the cost is too less and the actual cost what the developer will face, that will be too high. There should not be a gap between what the customer has quoted and what the developer wants. And then the schedule for the project, whether the customer has, it's not that the project is very big and the customer has given just a month's time. So the scheduling of the project is also very important, that by what time the project will be completed. So all these things again, they have to be considered, they have to be taken care, they have to be discussed and decided at the time of the making the SRS document only. Then the focus of the feasibility studies lies at how big is the gap between the original cost and schedule targets and the current estimates, what I told you just now. Then is the business model for the software justified, and when the current cost and schedule estimate are considered. Then have the major risk of the project been identified, what are the major risks that will be accompanied in the project and whether they can be surmounted or not. Is the specifications are complete and stable enough to support the remaining of the development work. So all these things have to be focused on the feasibility studies. Then have the users and the developers been able to agree on a detailed user interface prototype? That means what the user interface the customer wants and what the developer is going to develop. So are they, both of them are agreeing on a particular, on a point? If not, there are requirements really stable or not. If the software development plan complete and adequate to support further development work. That means if the software development plan really complete, is it not incomplete and inadequate so that the further development work can be done on it or not.